Hello there everyone, welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sai here today to discuss with you further about our US civil rights topic, and in this video we're going to look at some key protests and potential progress that happened in the early 1960s. Now, as I said in my previous video, there's a lot that happens in the 1960s, so I do hope you've gone back and checked up on all of our contextual knowledge in our previous videos to make sure you're up to scratch about our knowledge by this point. Do remember as well that these videos are geared towards the student level, so they provide some key content and knowledge, and the video is dedicated towards practicing our historical skills along the way. With all that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So as I said, we're going to look at three key campaigns that happened in the early 1960s in this video. And so it's very important to bear in mind what I said at the end of the last video, how while those four key groups we talked about, SNCC, CORE, SCLC, and the NAACP, while they are, of course, all working towards the same thing, they have slightly different ways of going about it, and they're not fully united yet. So this is going to be a key part about these three campaigns, as we'll see. So do bear that in mind as we go through them. Well, let ourselves get right into it. So the first key campaign we want to look at are the student sit-ins that occur in the early 1960s. Now, how do these sit-ins actually begin? Well, they start in a place called Greensboro, North Carolina. Now, this is a student-led campaign. It involves college students who are doing this. And it's actually four young African-American college students who start this campaign. They go into an all-white Woolworth cafeteria and they sit in the whites area part of the diner. This, of course, breaks the Jim Crow segregationist laws that are in place, where whites and African Americans cannot sit either together or in the segregated areas. When asked to leave, the students refuse to do so, and it ends police being called in and the four students being arrested. This makes international headlines and gets known throughout by media exposure, and it leads to other students taking up the mantle and also sitting in whites only areas in these Woolworths cafeterias. As many as 70,000 students get involved in these sit-ins across the southern states. And this is very significant because this leads to the birth of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, we discussed in our previous video. And this is really important because it shows that students, young African Americans, are being mobilized into action. These students are taking part in this campaign across the southern states. In fact, by 1961, some 150 cities had to react and begin to desegregate their public facilities to allow African Americans to sit with white cafeteria goers for the simple reason that they were losing their commerce by, you imagine the reaction, by having to get the police in every day to get these students arrested, to get them prosecuted. Suddenly you're losing business. There are many scenes occurring. Even whites would go to the cafeterias because they do not want to be around the African Americans. And also, especially while the police are there, they're losing business. And this calls back to a campaign in the 1920s when African Americans would stop shopping at whites only businesses. They want to prevent the white businesses from making money, and this is a real harm for them economically. But this does not mean that the communities were initially united in this cause. For instance, despite SNCC's coming to the fore and really providing a key action for the African American community, things like the NAACP did not fully support them. For instance, the lawyer Thurgood Marshall refused to even represent what he viewed as a bunch of crazy students in gaining litigation in the courts. And likewise, SNCC were also very opposed to the rise of Martin Luther King Jr. They did not like that he was leading from the top and forcing down orders on what they perceived as the grassroots level like themselves. And so they preferred to have a more independent action for students to take up the mantle and do campaigns themselves. This actually manifests in another thing, which is the voter registration campaign, where, as I alluded to in my last video, the students start meeting up in places like Baptist churches and independently helping African Americans try and gain the vote without relying on waiting for commands from what is perceived as a higher up in a different group altogether. Because remember, King's in the SCLC. He's not actually a member of SNCC or even technically the NAACP. But what is very clear, though, is that direct action can be a method for success. Americans don't necessarily rely on litigation in the Supreme Court like the NAACP have been doing for several years now. They actually can force action to occur by doing things themselves in everyday life. Now, as said, the rise of sit-ins is confirming that African American activism through direct action can create change. And so, CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, decide to do their own mass direct action as well. And they decided to do this in 1961, where they would have integrated groups travel to the southern states through interstate highways. Why is this important? Well, because they wanted to test if rulings like Morgan v. Virginia in 1946 would actually be upheld. Remember, we had an issue with Browder v. Gale and Rosa Parks proving that integration was not occurring at the state level, but CORE wanted to test if really this was also occurring at the interstate level as well. And so these integrated groups of whites and African Americans would get on their buses and they would travel from northern states down into the southern states to see what reaction they would be met with and see if the federal government would respond. As expected, they were indeed met with racist attacks. For instance, when one bus got to Alabama, the residents attacked them with clubs and chains and actually firebombed their buses. You can see with the image on the screen. This meant they actually would literally they would set it alight, blow it up, and even fatally harm the groups who were on those buses. However, unlike in the 1950s, there was a clear interest from the media to get involved and to see and witness these attacks. They became highly publicized, and so there was little doubt that these racist whites in the South were indeed attacking the African Americans and also whites as well, who were integrating and traveling with these African Americans. The response became so bad that the Attorney General at this time, Bobby Kennedy, responded by working to enforce those said Supreme Court rulings. And it also proves something that CORE's leader James Farmer famously said for justifying why he wanted to conduct this campaign. He said that he planned the Freedom Ride with the specific intention of creating a crisis. He was counting on the racists in the South to do the work for the African Americans. He and his group believed that the government would have to respond if a situation was created that made headline news not only all over the states, but all over the world and harmed America's image as well. Which again calls back, if you remember, to our World War II lesson, where we discussed how the whole reason America went abroad and was trying to assist in liberating nations that were taken over by the Axis powers were because they believed in liberal democracy and wanted to free them from oppression. However, they were not doing that at home, and places like the Soviet Union were pointing out the irony of America, that they were so-called the land of the free, but their own people were not truly free if they were not white. And so the final campaign we want to look at in this lesson is the Albany Campaign. And now this is the first real effort of these various groups in the African American civil rights movement coming together and trying to achieve action themselves. We have participation from SNCC, the NAACP, and even King and the SCLC will get involved by early 1962. It was very similar in nature to the coalition that had been built during the Montgomery bus boycott back in 1956, which was the Baptist churches of the South were going to work with the NAACP and the courts to overturn the race-based rules by popular protest. Theoretically then, because the movement is so big and there's thousands and thousands of African Americans working to achieve this, this should lead to another widespread victory like they achieved at Alabama. Why did they target Albany, Georgia? Well, this was a place where Jim Crow laws were quite harshly in place. African Americans were denied the vote, they were forced to accept Jim Crow laws, and they also lacked job opportunities. So, on the political, social, and economic themes, there's suffering in all three of them. The state police were also largely ignoring big issues that were occurring. For instance, there were several cases of many African American women being assaulted by white men, but yet police were not doing anything about it. This was something SNCC in particular was really furious about, leading to the students to really want to highlight and overturn this problem. Through protest, especially by breaking Jim Crow laws and customs, they hoped to provoke a violent, unjust response from the police. Albany had actually been uniquely free from things like the sit-ins and freedom rides that had occurred in the previous year, despite the fact that many African Americans were dissatisfied with the local police in the area. So, through the combination of these three groups, the Albany protesters used various methods such as non-violent, mass demonstrations, sit-ins, jail-ins, and also boycotting businesses to try and enforce change. As I said, we actually have a big movement here. We have the students and working class backgrounds from SNCC, we have the middle class residents from the NAACP, and we even have the Baptist religious people from the SCLC. However, Albany was not going to become the mass victory the civil rights movement wanted it to be, and this lied in the hands of the Albany police chief, Laurie Pritchett. He responded to the demonstration with mass arrests, but he refrained from allowing his police force from using brutal methods because he understood the media were taking a lot of notice of this campaign, and so he wanted to minimize negative publicity across America. He even used his police force to actually prevent white racist citizens from attacking the African Americans, very wary of the media using such images to try and discredit the Southern whites nationally and internationally, like they had done with the Greensboro sit-ins and the Freedom Rising in 1961. Still, though, the movement turned to King, who had been highly successful in Montgomery, to try and enact some change. By King simply being there, national media attention really skyrocketed in the area and inspired many more members of the African American community to join the protests. Pritchett turned to arresting King in one of the jail-ins as well. By doing so, King was unable to organize the movement effectively, and also, quite key, media attention began to die down, and the union between the groups began to become more fractured. For instance, SNCC began to believe that King turning up in Albany gained media attention solely to boost the credibility of the SCLC, rather than actually to help the movement achieve any concrete change. And therefore, this meant the media, particularly things like the New York Times, were reporting that the SCLC and SNCC were actually competing with each other rather than working together. And that actually King's group was bossing around and even bullying SNCC and the students to falling into line. And this really dampened support for the civil rights movement and actually weakened any progress they were trying to make. For all intents and purposes, Pritchett had been quite successful in turning the media against the civil rights movement and making him and his police force look quite moderate, quite calm, even quite fair towards the African Americans. Pritchett even finished this off by even releasing King from prison when asked and allowing him to leave the area on the promise that they would desegregate some facilities and not rearrest King. However, once King had left, they just carried on with the desegregation anyway. But because of the loss of mass media support, federal government didn't really get involved, didn't really feel any sort of inclination to try and fix anything because it seemed there was nothing to fix. What came out of this campaign, though, was a clear learning curve for the civil rights movement. King himself very clearly said that there was a clear division within the groups and that they had to unite to have far greater success to succeed in achieving civil rights rather than disagreeing over who was the leader and who was not. Other things they also wanted to learn as well was to focus their campaign on one thing. As said, they'd done a lot in Albany with the jail-ins, the sit-ins, the protests, the direct action. Perhaps maybe they should focus, like they've done in Montgomery, on just one key thing at a time. Take small, gradual steps securely rather than leap so far they end up stumbling and falling along the way. They also had to find a way to provoke the police force into action. They had to go somewhere maybe where a moderate like Laurie Pritchett was not to be found and they could force some key action to actually occur. And the third key lesson was quite clearly unity. Whatever the groups did together, they had to do it together. They could not fall out, they could not disagree, especially because the media was very fickle. One minute it could be supporting them, the next it could be pointing out their flaws for all to see in society. So Albany is a key learning campaign, and the question really is, will the civil rights movement actually learn from it? Well, that's what we're going to find out in our following lesson. As always, I do hope you found this video quite insightful. What have you learned most about this campaign? Does it surprise you how much disunity there is in the movement at this stage? And how do you think the groups will come together and find a way to unite in the following years? Do make sure you subscribe and comment below. Your engagement is always appreciated in these lessons. This has been History with Sire. Thank you for listening.